Today, I'm excited to be joined by Paralympic medalist Sarah Adam, a doctor and professor of occupational therapy at St. Louis University, and a wheelchair rugby athlete and trailblazer as the first woman to compete for Team USA in wheelchair rugby at the Paralympic Games. We'll be diving deeper into the topic of adaptive sports for kids, including recent research and actionable takeaways you can implement right away. Welcome to Pediatric Pioneers, a MedBridge podcast where we conquer challenging topics for the pediatric therapist through conversations with pioneers who have blazed new trails in our practice. Our aim is to deliver actionable takeaways for practitioners like you. To receive continuing education credit for this episode and access bonus resources, make sure you check out medbridge.com. Hello, I'm your host, Nicole Quint, and I'm an occupational therapist with over 20 years of experience in practice and academia, specializing in pediatric practice and the improvement of occupational participation and performance through my expertise on executive function, visual perception, social emotional learning, sleep, and sensory processing. It is my passion to support pediatric therapists like you so that you can best serve the families under your care with evidence-based practice solutions, easy to implement advocacy approaches, and new ways to lean into your skills within the challenging pediatric landscape. Welcome, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Could you get us started by sharing a little bit more about yourself and how you are involved with adaptive sports?
Yeah, so currently a professor at St. Louis University teaching occupational therapy. I was able to practice clinically for 5 years working with people with stroke and brain injury. Absolutely loved it, but I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was actually in graduate school to become an OT. So I knew I'd only be able to practice for a little while and then switch to teaching, which really was a natural switch because as OTs, what do we just educate. So instead of educating patients and caregivers, I'm now educating our students, and I absolutely love being here at St. Louis University. I got actually introduced to adaptive sports as an OT student. It was part of our extra experiences outside of the classroom. And so I wanted to combine my love of sports that I had done, always competitive growing up, and my new love of OT, and adaptive sports was a perfect fit. So working with our local organization here in St. Louis called the Disabled Athlete Sports Association, or DASA, and went to a wheelchair rugby practice and just fell in love with the community, fell in love with the sport, and been involved ever since.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting story. So it sounds like you were already doing adaptive sports before your diagnosis, and then
I
the
was.
experience kind of carried with you.
Yeah, and it ended up being kind of fortuitous because, for me, once I had that MS diagnosis, and I was still able to go run and play kickball and rec softball and all of that for a while, but at some point that became really difficult for me and my body to do in the way that I wanted to be able to do it. And so having that connection immediately to adaptive sports and adaptive sport equipment kind of lessened that gap of the woe is me, now I can't go shoot hoops or go for a run, or the things that were kind of my mental and physical outlet. I was able to switch to just doing it in an adaptive way very quickly. And I think that was really life-changing, life-saving for me, to be honest, to become an adaptive athlete right away and keep that identity as an athlete as a big part of who I am.
So, I mentioned that you were in the Paralympics on Team USA for wheelchair rugby, and congratulations. I was completely glued to the screen the whole time, cheering for you all. It was amazing. But you're the first woman on Team USA, correct?
Not the first woman, the first one to compete in a Paralympic Games, which is a true honor, particularly right now with women in sports. It's just exploding in popularity, and to be part of that conversation and part of that movement has been an awesome opportunity for me. And I think it's really important, given it's a sport called murder ball. And so it's a very physical sport and very male dominated. And so having the opportunity to show that females have a place in that sport as well. And I think we're seeing it all over the nation, whether we're talking about females playing hockey or football or these, lacrosse, all these other sports that were previously considered male dominated, wrestling, I could keep going. It's important to show that if that's what you love doing, don't let the fact that it's stereotypically for males prevent you from competing and playing.
And I know I was loving every interview that you did, or any kind of, where NBC was talking about things and they would mention that you were an occupational therapist. So that was the added cool factor to the whole situation.
Yeah, amazing. Honestly, amazing platforms left and right over the last year plus to expose people to adaptive sports, to occupational therapy, to things that I love and are so meaningful in my life. To be able to share that with others is been something that I hope to continue to do. I signed up to compete for LA in 2028 with the Olympics and
Yay!
Paralympics being on our home soil, and so I think the next 4 years are going to be really important for the disability community, for the adaptive sports community, to have a little bit more visibility. And I hope to be a part of that.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me a little bit about why you think it's important to discuss adaptive sports and even at a competitive level when we're talking about pediatric occupational therapy. What questions should we be asking as therapists that work with this population? Is there anything that we should be questioning or thinking about as occupational therapists working in pediatrics and really thinking about adaptive sports for our families, our kids and their families, and the benefits that it brings?
Oh gosh, so many different ways I could take this. I kind of want to start with my experience getting into it, because I think sometimes about if I went to a different OT school than one down here in St. Louis, I may not have been exposed to adaptive sports, because the fact is it's not everywhere in the United States, particularly in some of those more rural areas. Like their cities tend to have a great adaptive sports program, but if you don't live in a city, you may not have the same kind of access. And access is a really important part for this. And so for me, if I went to a different, and I almost did, and went to a university up in the Quad Cities, then I may not have been introduced to adaptive sports. And I think I would still be very much trying to, quote unquote, fix myself and continue trying to, you know, walk and be as able-bodied as I possibly could, instead of saying I can feel comfortable with my disability identity. I can continue to be an athlete. I can be a disabled athlete. I can play sports. I can have that outlet. And so it's important that we're exposing people to that option. And I think it's not as common, for people, particularly outside of cities, to know that this exists and this is something that they can do. And there's a lot of barriers to parents understanding what the different options are for their kiddos. But I think sports for any kid, able-bodied or disabled, is an important part of life for physical health, peers, social connections, confidence, leadership skills. There's so many reasons why being in a sport, and particularly in team sports, is important for anybody. And so I want to be like screaming from the rooftops for everybody to hear, for parents, for kids to hear that this is something that exists and is something that's out there for them. And for me, it's helped reconnect with a sense of normalcy. And I think that's what I've seen it do for a lot of kids, is in a lot of families, to help them kind of reconnect with normal.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I've heard you speak before about the role we have in occupational therapy in making adaptive sports more accessible, to address this accessibility concern.
Yeah, because it's an expensive thing when you think about putting on, as a kid, if you want to go play hoops, you have maybe a $80, $90 pair of shoes and a basketball. You can go pick up anywhere. There's all sorts of leagues and different opportunities. But for a kid maybe with spina bifida or cerebral palsy or a different condition, it involves like a $6,000 basketball chair for them to compete in. And it's not like they can just go to the local playground and find some kids. It's like, you got to be really organized, and you have to rent out the gyms. And so it's expensive. It has to be very planned. The equipment all has to fit that kiddo in a particular way for them to be successful at it. And so as OTs, I think we've got that great mindset of both how the body moves, like a wheelchair setup that they might need, or equipment setup. We can help them adapt the equipment to be successful to them. We can match their functional abilities with a sport that they might enjoy and be good at. And so I think just that connection that OTs have to disability and understanding the benefit of physical activity as well, we can kind of connect those two things to get kiddos out there and playing in different sports, and help parents feel comfortable with what, it can seem, especially a sport like murder ball, it's a full contact wheelchair sport. And then even basketball, they're bumping into each other, they're flipping over in the chairs sometimes. And it can be a little startling for parents of like, my kid with a disability, they're fragile. I don't want them to get hurt. They have all these extra needs. But to say, no, they're not. It's okay for them to get flipped in the chair, and they will put them back up on their wheels, and they'll keep playing. And some of that learning is important. So as OTs, being in the healthcare world, we can help, I think, put some of that at ease for parents to say, no, this can be a safe thing, and it can be really beneficial for the kids.
Yeah, recommending murder ball. You might want to you might want to call it rugby.
I think that's why, they started calling it wheelchair rugby. It's a little more palatable.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Well, that leads into this idea of mindset, right? How do we shift the mindset of these families? What would your recommendation for that be?
I think exposing him to it. I remember, my mom, when she found out that I had MS, was so worried about what's my future going to look like for my daughter. What, is she always going to need help or assistance? And so I took her to a wheelchair rugby tournament, and there's over 200 people in wheelchairs, quadriplegics, that were living life happily and have families and jobs and driving. And if they fell out of their chair, people kind of giggled and then help them up. And like just that, again, that normalcy. And I think for her, it was this like a relief of my daughter's going to be okay despite the disability. This isn't going to slow her down. And I think the same thing can happen when we bring parents to, and we just had our local wheelchair rugby tournament here in St. Louis, and there was a bunch of little kiddos that came to watch, and parents that were able to see all of us living life successfully as people with disabilities, and they can kind of see, oh, okay, that's my kid has a future that is just as fulfilling as anybody. And I think it's important for the kids. I think it's important for the parents to see that as well.
Yeah, and they have someone to look up to now too. And
I think it's been a fun part for us with Team USA highlighting the Paralympics a little bit more and getting some of that visibility. Is my teammate talks about when he was growing up with his disability, because he's had it since birth. Like, he didn't have anybody to look up to as like him. All of his favorite athletes were NBA stars or NFL quarterbacks or whatever, and now it's like he is the superstar to some of these kiddos that look up to him and say, oh my goodness, I can be that. And I think that's really powerful.
I think another thing I'm hearing you say too, and it was very powerful how you described it with your mother, is that sense of community and having the family see that you are opening up this community to this kid or adolescent and to the family. And I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, there was a huge group of supporters at our tournament, a lot of them with disabilities, and from adults to kids, and they were all hanging out and talking and figuring out, oh, what piece of equipment is that? How do you do this? How do you drive? How did you get what you needed to go back to school after your injury? How did you, all sorts of different ways to get things done and live life that you don't necessarily learn unless you're around other people with disabilities who have successfully figured it out. And so there's just so much learning and sharing going on in that little community there. And then parents were connecting with each other. And also like that's finally somebody who, wow, they get it. They get what I'm going through trying to raise this kid, and some shared camaraderie in that's important.
Yeah. And I think that's another way you kind of broach the subject with families. So thinking about all these great benefits, right, and all these doors that are opening, but knowing there's still some barriers, what does the research say? Because we want to talk about really evidence-based approaches here about adaptive sports and the benefits of doing adaptive sports. Can you give us some of the highlights from what the research is saying?
It's tricky. The research, trying to study this population is difficult. There's so many variables, even within a disability. Think about MS as an example. There are so many different ways that it presents itself. And whether we're talking spinal cord injury, MS, spina bifida, CP, all these different disabilities, trying to control for all the variables to be able to say X, if you work out 3 times a week at moderate intensity for 100, we've got that for the able bodies that they say, 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise can lead to physiological changes because it's a little bit easier to study that population. But it's when we talk about disability, we don't really have that same research to suggest dosage and frequency for physiological changes. But what we do have is plenty of research, a lot of qualitative research to suggest it improves physiological, mental health, peer support and social, like all these quality of life factors that make humongous changes when we get people involved in either adaptive sports or exercise. Because, thinking about it practically, if I'm in the gym and I'm lifting, or if I'm going and shooting hoops and pushing my chair, I'm getting stronger, and those things lead to improvements in my independence, my ability to transfer myself, my ability to take care of my ADLs, all those things that we need to do in our daily life as well.
Mm-hmm. And you're getting oxygen to the brain. So that's always a good thing too, right?
Yeah. And like, I shouldn't admit this, but I really hate going into a gym and lifting. But I love, I'll go shoot hoops for hours. I'll go play rugby for hours. So it's like a fun, meaningful, engaging way to have a lot of physiological health changes. I took a month and a half, almost 2 months off after Paris to give my body a little bit of a break. And I actually felt worse by the end of it because I need to move my body. I'm really not a very pleasant person to be around if I don't have that outlet, like mentally. And so I think being able to have that kind of outlet that move your body, improve your strength, improve a lot of different physiological parts it just made me feel so much better. And I've seen it do the same thing for countless other people. But when you don't have access to it, it's hard.
Yeah, we know that we're getting different, serotonin and different things released when we're doing physical activity. So, and maybe there isn't a ton of research about the specific, like you said, the dosage, things like that for kids, but we know foundationally the benefits of physical activity,
Yep.
right? But what about, now let's take that physical activity. We know that it helps with cognition. We know it helps with strength. We know it helps with endurance, right? Mobility. But what about adaptive sports? What does that now add beyond, like you said, you don't even love lifting weights and just doing like the typical gym scene. You like the sports piece of it. So what does the adaptive sports, what does the research in adaptive sports say the benefits are?
I think a lot of it's that meaning. When we talk about being occupational therapists, we're connecting people back to their occupations that are meaningful to them. And there's a lot of people who sports and being an athlete is part of their identity. It is what brings meaning. And to me, that's what brings joy. And then in addition, the kind of peer support part of it, like I don't particularly like going to a peer support group where I'm just sitting at a table and talking. It tends to me become a little bit of a woe is me, but to go out and play sports. We've got practice tonight for our local team for wheelchair rugby, and we'll talk about our days and our weekend and things that happened to us that were funny or hard or difficult or what, and support each other in that way. And to be around people that are going through similar experiences is so, so, so important. And the research is saying the same thing, that when people have access to adaptive sports and can be a part of a team, that it improves a lot of their self-confidence, their self-esteem, they're trying new things, they're okay with learning through failure, and that's important.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's those added benefits, like you said, some of the emotional regulation and things like that too. So it's kind of interesting too, because I know I just saw a study not too long ago about if you have an identity as an athlete, it carries through your life, even if you're still not doing that sport.
Yeah.
And those folks that have that identity tend to be more physically active throughout their life than those that don't have that identity. So I think that identity piece is important to this, kind of conversation about adaptive sports as well.
Yeah, I think we tend to offer it to people like a 19-year-old that had a spinal cord injury that's in the hospital that was a basketball player, a baseball player. And it's obvious to try to reconnect them. But I think some of these kids that are growing up with their disability, it's like we forget that to expose them to sports and say, hey, you might want to be an athlete. You might enjoy these different sports, or you might pinhole them into one sport instead of saying, look, there's so many. Like when I look at some of my friends who have kids that are able-bodied, and they're in every single gymnastics and soccer and basketball. They sign them up for everything. It's like we need to be doing the same thing for our kiddos with disabilities. And, luckily we have a great organization here in St. Louis. And I know there are many across the nation that offer that and let kids try out a whole bunch of different sports, just like their siblings are probably doing, and let them decide what they enjoy and what they connect with.
Yeah, that's a great point. So earlier you said one of the challenges with adaptive sports is accessibility. Is there anything in the research that talks about increasing participation or reducing some of the accessibility issues or creating more opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, the access is really the biggest barriers with the access is where you live right now. So people that live in the rural areas that don't have access to a local organization, because think about our local organization has a huge closet full of track chairs, rugby chairs, basketball chairs. Like every sport has a different kind of piece of equipment, piece of adaptive equipment that allows people to be successful in playing that sport. And if you don't have access to it, to even trial it, then it's hard to figure out what sport you enjoy and what you might want to do, or even to participate at all. And then even like the numbers of people, there's just not that many people with disabilities in different areas. So like for us, there's one wheelchair rugby team here in St. Louis. So anytime that we want to go play, we have to go travel across the nation, which involves, planes or long car trips, and traveling with the disability is not always that easy. And so I think even just helping educate on, well, number one, where are these organizations and programs? Because oftentimes they'll ship equipment or they'll drive and meet you halfway to provide a piece of equipment for a family to rent for a little while and trial it out. But also teaching about travel and how do you travel as a person with a disability. These kids, they're it's incredible, 7, 8 years old, and every weekend they're flying all around the nation with their families to go compete in wheelchair basketball, which I think is really cool. Yeah. What a great opportunity for families to be together and for the kids to get to travel and learn how to be more independent and try out new things as they are also playing basketball and playing a sport and learning those skills.
Right. So, now that we kind of understand a little bit about this research and obviously realizing that there's accessibility issues and some cost involved and maybe some challenges in the rural areas, how do we kind of help our practicing therapists, translate this research into working with the kids that they work with and the families that they work with so they can kind of make this work or make these opportunities work? So are there certain patients or conditions that you think are most appropriate, or?
I think there's a sport for just about any condition out there. I mean, a really neat one is boccia. There's people who just have movement in their mouth that are able to compete at the Paralympic level in boccia. So it's just finding out, kind of what are their abilities and how does that match with different sports. So for example, me, because I don't really have great hand function, I'm not going to go out there and play wheelchair lacrosse very successfully because I can't hold on to the stick, but I can hold on to a rugby ball and pass that pretty well. And so trying out all those different sports, but we have to be knowledgeable that they exist. And I do think it's part of our responsibility as occupational therapists to at least know that adaptive sports is out there. You have to know where we can go explore those resources. Move United is probably the one that I recommend the most. It's just a national organization that will connect anybody around the United States with their local adaptive sports programs and opportunities. There's educational videos on there. And then helping constantly be a contact point for your patients and for those families and keep bringing it up, because sometimes you're not quite ready to hear it. You're not right in the right phase of life. Maybe you've just had an injury, or you're just sort of getting exposed to it and thinking about it. And so continue to bring it up to say do you have any interest, or are you okay? Do you want to come to this practice that's local? Pair up with your adaptive sports organization. Like ours goes to the hospitals, once a week, and they just kind of make rounds. And if there's a patient that's interested, they'll bring a piece of equipment to them. These organizations and people that are involved in adaptive sports, we want to get others involved. We know how it's changed our lives and how important it is for us, and we want to do the same for others. So we're such a welcoming community, and we'll keep coming back and we'll keep circling back with those families if they're showing some interest. But we have to know that it exists. We have to be willing to introduce it to our patients. Even when you're thinking, I don't know if they're going to be interested. I don't know if they're ready to hear that. They're just focusing on their ADLs and basic life skills. You can do that and also expose them to adaptive sports.
Yeah. And I think down here in South Florida, I know we have an adaptive sports day that's sponsored by a local hospital group. Yep. And then, and luckily there's an OT who runs that program. And so there's those kinds of opportunities. And of course, in Florida, we have weather that's also helpful.
Yes.
And some other things, there's adapted scuba diving and adapted snorkeling and some other cool opportunities. But I like how you brought up the boccia ball, because I think maybe not everybody understands what boccia ball is. I don't know. Maybe we should explain that a little bit.
Oh gosh, how to explain boccia? So bocce is the able-bodied outdoor version, but it's being able to get a ball like as close to the white ball. That's a horrible explanation. To be fair, not my sport. But I think the point is it's a competitive sport that's out there that is an option for people with a disability. But I think, when you said bringing adaptive sports out into the community, it's actually one of my favorite things that I do in my free time is go with DASA, and we'll go 2-3 hours away, bring a bunch of our equipment and hold these adaptive sports days, whether for OT schools or for a local community. And I think what we can provide, because our local organization doesn't have OTs on staff. They have some rec therapists on staff, some social workers, but no OTs or PTs. And so when we go, we have a better eye for movement and functional ability and adaptation and health conditions that we can, help make sure that we're doing it in a safe way for our clients as well. So I love going along on those excursions, I guess we'll call them. It's always a fun time.
Well, I think that you have a great point that if I'm the therapist and I'm working with my client in therapy and I contact one of these organizations, they have the knowledge and expertise about the sports, but I have the knowledge and expertise about this child and what he or she is able to do, what I know they like. And then I can look, as they explain those sports to me, I can look at the affordances of those sports and see if it's a good match.
Exactly.
And so that's really, I think it's just getting that connection to those organizations that you're recommending, knowing what's out there.
Yeah. And being willing to contact them and knowing that those organizations want you to contact. They want to expose the adaptive sports to as many people as possible. So, if you give one phone call, I promise they'll come and excitedly so, and bringing the equipment and trying to get your client involved and connected with the community that can be so helpful. I think as OT, sometimes we like to put everything on our shoulders. We think we do it all, and it's like we do a lot, but we can also lean on some of our partners. And it is really an interdisciplinary effort of involving the PTs and the rec therapists and the social workers and all sorts of people that are going to help provide access to that kiddo, because it is kind of it takes a village for the adaptive sports to work.
Right. And so, that brings me to the idea of adapted physical education in the schools. So I know you've talked a little bit about this before too. What role do they play in this process?
For the schools, you're saying?
Yeah, for physical education or PE,
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more integration there of kids that have a disability being able to participate in PE alongside their able-bodied peers. And this happened, Tatiana McFadden's actually the one that really was a pioneer in advocating for her to be able to compete in track right alongside her able-bodied peers. Because why not? And so now we're seeing that happening a little bit more. Like I said, it's hard because it's not like there's enough kids that are going to be with a disability that want to play wheelchair basketball at one high school. But perhaps for the entire city, there's enough. And then, we can have a team of everybody that's in that city playing wheelchair basketball, and they can provide the gym space for that. But I think that having the adaptive equipment available at the schools as much as possible for kids to try. We're seeing that happening a little bit more. The schools are partnering with our local adaptive sports organizations to come out and bring like the adaptive sports day into the schools, which is a neat way for kids. They'll jump in, all of the kids jump in and play with the equipment and learn about adaptive sports. And it creates a nice bridge because a lot of kids and a lot of people understand sports, but they don't necessarily understand disability. And so if we can get them playing adaptive sports, it's like a nice way for them to understand, these kids with disabilities, some of my classmates with disabilities aren't that much different than me. And they're playing a sport that looks similar, just in a slightly different way. I think that's a pretty neat way to get kids comfortable with disability and normalizing disability.
And also realizing like wheelchair basketball is hard. I've tried to play it before and I have a newfound respect. Once you play it, you kind of realize like, wow. And I think that's eye-opening to people who haven't experienced it too.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever gotten a kid into a basketball chair or a rugby chair, able-bodied or otherwise, that hasn't just had a blast and loved it and had so much fun. And so now they're inquiring and curious about the people who play this sport, and then get to learn about the different disabilities, and again, get to see us being competitive athletes. When you're turning on for the Paralympics, it was all over the place. It was on regular TV, which was wild, but for them to like flip through that and what is this? This is wheelchair rugby. This is wheelchair basketball. and seeing us being competitive elite athletes, just like they would see, the NBA players.
Yeah, it was awesome. I was so excited that it was on, like all the sports were being represented on TV. I grew up as a competitive swimmer, so I'm always into the swimming for the Olympics, and I was glued for the Paralympic swimming. It was wonderful.
Yeah, and it was, normally we haven't had quite as much visibility and easy access. It was like you get a link to a website that you're having to share out to everybody. That would sometimes work. And so for us to have access to major TV outlets, having it on prime time, having it available, there was like tabs that you could watch every single one of our games and easily find everything for the Paralympics. There was a huge step forward, I think, for the disability movement too. And when we talk about equity and access.
And all of those things are on YouTube. So families right now, like if you're an OT, you can bring that to the families now and your kids that you're working with to say, here's some things to look at.
Yeah.
And see what they're interested in, see what speaks to them, and even have an idea before you have an organization come out there. So I think it's a great resource for us as OTs. So
yeah, it was pretty neat after some of our games that, we go meet our families and different people right after the games in the Paralympics. And there was a lot of kids that were there that had disabilities that were just so excited to meet us and get our autographs and take our photos and knew who we were. And it was cool to be acknowledged in that way. But I think it was more important for us to see that kids were getting excited about the adaptive sports that they could play. And they were having dreams and aspirations of one day competing in the Paralympics. And so those goals are so important for kids to have.
Yeah. And the research is very clear. It doesn't matter what I call it your occupational vision, but what your goal is, even if you say you want to be a famous NBA player or a famous rock star, you have to have that as a kid to motivate you through all the challenges that life brings us. So to me, bringing those dreams to those kids is huge, huge, huge.
Yeah, it gives them a why. We talk about that a lot on our team is what's your why? Why are you doing this? Because the motivation is going to wax and wane, but the why will kind of keep you pushing through that. And so when the kids have that ultimate goal of wanting to be in the Paralympics, even when there's little setbacks and maybe times where they end up back in the hospital or times where their disease flares up or all these different things that just happen in life, they keep pushing through and keep plugging away because they have that goal that they want to achieve.
Right. So I'm thinking about, all these different stakeholders involved in this process. And I loved earlier how you said you've got to lean into this interprofessional and 2 brains, 3 brains, 4 brains are better than 1, right? So we want to bring people and all their expertise into the fold here. But what do we need to consider, when we're considering the perspectives of the stakeholders, other care providers, the patients and their families, or the clients and their families? Are there some talking points, other strategies that we could use, or even word choices? Like we said, murder ball might not be the way to go. Even though I have some families that I work with that probably would have been like, yeah, sign them up.
Kids love it. The kids love telling their friends, I play murder ball. Like, what a cool thing for a 12-year-old to be able to tell his
exactly
friends.
But are there some things that you would suggest to aid in buy-in and carry over, even if maybe the families do have to schedule some of these things, or, how do we kind of make that work?
Yeah, I think some of its education is still needed, particularly, if sometimes physicians are a little bit nervous. They tend to be a bit more on the careful side of things and not wanting to have their patients doing something that is so strenuous or physical for some of these conditions. Like myself with MS, I'm constantly being told, unfortunately, by my physicians to not train as an elite athlete, that it would be detrimental to my body. And I'm having to educate them on all the reasons why it is helpful and beneficial and can be done safely. So some of it's the education piece there. And then I think really talking about it like somebody's functional abilities and highlighting abilities versus deficits, and finding the ways that they can participate. Because there's a million reasons that make it difficult, sure, or a million reasons to maybe not do it, but there's so many more reasons why we would want to expose it and just try it, give it a shot. And know that you're doing it in a supportive community, in a knowledgeable community where we can help in guiding. And I think the more people that you have in that community, the more interdisciplinary assistance there, the more comfortable people are with saying, okay, yeah, let's give this a shot.
Hmm. I like how you said, just even saying let's try it or let's see what you think is a big piece. It's just kind of like let's just introduce it and see what's going on. I like that.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
know,
Sometimes you just got to jump in the deep end and see what happens. And I think people are more willing to do that when, number one, they see others successfully doing it, and are exposed to others in examples, and then as well have that supportive community behind them.
hmm and it's really that strengths-based approach is really key to it as well. Talking about your kid is really good at this. I think he would really like this, or he would be great at this, and he might get a lot of meaning and joy out of this.
Yeah, and normalizing it, because it
hmm
really shouldn't be that much different than what you would expose an able-bodied kid to.
hmm
It's really fun for me to watch our kids basketball team here. Their siblings are the ones sitting in the stands watching them compete. Because for most of their life, I'm sure the kid with the disability was having to be dragged to their siblings' events and watching their siblings compete and
hmm
watching their siblings get to play with their peers. And now for them to get to go and be the ones that get to play, and hey, we're going to go to little Johnny's wheelchair basketball game tonight.
hmm
Um, that's important. That's really, really, really
Yeah.
important for that normalization, and equity within that family dynamic too.
Right. So what would be like, I'm thinking about the accessibility kind of sticking with me because I understand the challenges that you're bringing forth. Like there's not enough kids for the wheelchair team, whether it's rugby or basketball. But what about something like, I know most of us are familiar with Special Olympics or other organizations like that. Are they more readily available in some of these more rural areas or
Yeah,
less
I
populated
think they're a little
areas?
more well known. So here in St. Louis, we have a really nice model that I think is being adopted in a lot of places, where we have one organization that's responsible for sports and adaptive recreation for kids with intellectual disability, and then sports and recreation, a different organization for kiddos with physical disabilities but no intellectual deficits. And I think it's an important distinction there,
hmm
of even the goals for what we're trying to achieve. When we
hmm
think about the Paralympics, it's not just everybody gets to play, get a pat on the back. It's a competitive, elite athlete atmosphere, and a lot of kids want that and need the kind of strict coaching and
hmm
accountability and all that we want to give for our kiddos with the physical disabilities that maybe we're not necessarily aiming for our kiddos with intellectual disabilities, who it is just like, we love that you're participating, moving your body and having fun and enjoying. So there's just the differences too between recreation and competitive. And I think right now, when we're talking about the organization that helps kids with physical disabilities or adults, it's still
hmm
really hard because half of our people on the team are really competitive and have aspirations for the Paralympics, and half just want to have fun and play. And so being able to offer those different levels and goals is, I think, something that we're still working on and trying to figure out what's the best way to achieve that within an organization and provide opportunities no matter what your goal is.
Right. And that goes back to that question about like kind of the how do we get the buy-in and everything. And it's like you were talking about, framing sports and adaptive or physical activity as essential, right? But also adding that discussion about the context of competitiveness. What does that bring to the table? Is that the right fit for this child? I'm going to be honest, when I was working with the kids that I was working with, I would really think about what sports am I recommending to them. And I kind of focused in on strengths of the kid. I focused in on the social piece of it and the community. I'm not so sure I focused enough on the competitiveness.
Yeah, and I think the responsibility part of it too. Like, what
hmm
you're signing up for something. It's a commitment. You're
hmm
responsible to your teammates. You need to listen to your coach.
hmm
You are going to get feedback on your performance, and these are things that lead into what happens as you age in real life and into work. And they say a lot of the leaders that you see, the CEOs, they were athletes, they were competitive
hmm
athletes, and they were taught these skills from a young age through the use of sports that then help when they're in their real life, whether it's time management, communication skills, figuring out goals, identifying goals. All that stuff happens through a lot of it through sport. And so that's
Yeah.
important for kids to get exposed to, all kids to get exposed to or have the opportunity.
And some anticipatory problem solving.
Yeah.
You got to pack your bag. If you don't have your shoes, for whatever your race is, or you forgot your, whatever it was that you needed that was equipment,
Oh
what are you
yeah,
going to do?
I check the weather app now every time before I leave, and I swear to you, every time that I do it and I ask the weather app, well, like, what's the weather outside? I think about going to all those softball games at 10, 12 years old and not having my Under Armour or whatever long sleeves, it's freezing
Mhm.
cold and mimiserable. Like
Right.
that, it's small things, but they add up and they do make meaningful differences in your everyday life.
Right. So, all of this stuff I think is really helpful. So, as we think about getting these kids into adaptive sports, giving them access to it, and thinking about the strengths of the child, talking to the family, what if we're talking maximal impact, what would be your 3 top actionable takeaways for our therapists to bring into practice?
I think it starts with knowledge of what's out there. And so I think to OTs to take it upon themselves to understand some of the different adaptive sports that exist so that you
Mhm.
can start making those recommendations. And sometimes I mean just pulling out the laptop with the kid, with the parents right there and seeing,
Mhm.
okay, let's take a look. Let's go on YouTube. Let's go on Move United. Let's find out where if there's a local adaptive sports organization around. But to baseline, just have that kind of information available.
Mhm.
And then I think number two is helping maybe even the funding sources. So there's,
Mhm.
it's expensive. Like my rugby chairs anywhere between 10 and 15 grand. And it is
Mhm.
expensive to participate in adaptive sports, unfortunately. But there's a lot of great fundings and grant sources to be able to trial equipment, get your own equipment. And so OTs can help in making those connections to just remove some of those barriers. And then understanding also the barriers of like transportation, and
Mhm.
because that's a huge part of it. And so helping educate on transportation and health within the sport, because there's a lot of, when I'm in my rugby chair, it's a different seating position that can lead to skin breakdown, or I don't sweat so I overheat, or there's so many different medical aspects to that we do need to acknowledge exist for the adaptive athlete that don't exist for an able-bodied athlete. So being knowledgeable about some of those and being able to help educate your clients and educate the parents about those things so that we can help them understand this can be done safely. This is something that's an opportunity and a possibility for your kid.
Mhm. Finding that right fit for them and making sure that it's going to work with them and kind of connecting them to those resources. So you made some good suggestions about the organizations, and I'm glad that you repeated that. I know we'll have that information available for folks. Um, with the funding sources, is there somewhere that you recommend that we look at for those funding sources?
The biggest one in the United States is called the Challenge Athletes Foundation, and they're for every type of disability. A lot of the other ones are disability specific. So, like if you have a spinal cord injury, you can go to Kelly Brush, or and so you have to do a little bit of Googling. Move United also has some connections and resources on their site to help kind of funnel you to the right ones.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it just starts with a Google search to see what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So, in thinking about this, I always love to bring up like a success story.
Mm-hmm.
And without maybe necessarily saying names of people or anything like that, do you have a success story that you could share beyond your own? I mean, your own is obviously very inspiring and helpful, but one with maybe a younger client where you kind of know
Yeah.
somebody went through this process?
Actually, one of my I guess what has inspired me to go around and speaking on this to OTs in particular started because of a teammate of mine. She was in an accident when she was 13 and ended up with a spinal cord injury. And she was in rehab and with a male that was around her age, similar injury. And the male kid was watching Murderball, which is a documentary on wheelchair rugby, a pretty popular one. And she
Mhm.
looked over and she's like, "Oh, what is that?" She asked her therapist, "What is he watching?" And she said, "Oh, don't worry about that. That's not for you." And whether it was because she was a female or whether it's because of her level of injury, she didn't really have a lot of movement or strength in her arms or in her hands yet. And so you think, oh, that she won't play sports. I don't need to introduce sports. And 10 years later, she came to one of our development camps and I got to meet her. And she had only just then, for her whole life, however many years, I don't really do math, I'm an OT, but for however many years, she had to rely on PCAs, personal care attendants, and needed a lot of assistance. She was using a power chair, and within a month of being exposed to wheelchair rugby, she was in a manual chair, which is a lot easier to get around in and travel with. It also improves a lot of physiological health indicators to be in a manual chair over a power chair when you're able to use it. She had then, within a year of playing wheelchair rugby, moved down to Arizona, was very independent, only needed help for one or two things, driving back at school, all these things that she reconnected because of being, around other people with her similar disability, her similar athletic mindset, the strength changes that she had. Her whole life changed from needing a ton of assistance to being independent and traveling and now making Team USA. And that's going to open up doors for her. And I remember turning and be like, what took you so long? It's just like, I wasn't exposed to it. Nobody told me about that this exists, or this could exist for me. And so now I think, like, had she been exposed all those years later, where would she be now? And how different would her life be? And so it's like, I want people exposing kids to adaptive sports early, because it changes so many things for people with disabilities. Whether we've been talking about it the whole podcast, but the confidence to just put yourself out there and be comfortable in your skin as a person with a disability, reconnect with your identity as an athlete, improve your body health, just so many different things.
Yeah,
we have to expose them.
Yeah, I think I hear that story, and it's like a cascading effect, right? Of all these benefits that just sort of build on each other. And without that, she might still be that person who was not able to do all these other things and still dependent on a lot of care and not as healthy.
Yeah. And I still get to see it every year. We have tryouts, and, there's some we call them newbies that come, and maybe they haven't been injured for very long. And I see them watch us, because obviously we have our training, and then we go down to the dorms and we have meals together and hang out and whatever, shoot hoops and play catch and live life. And I see them kind of watching how somebody transfers in and out of their chair, in and out of bed, or how they do their bowel routine, or how, all these different life skills. I see these new athletes, these new injuries, watching and learning and figuring out and trying new things and getting new chair setups that are better for them, everyday chair setups that fit them better, more comfortable, allow them to do more. But you have to be around a community of people, and of people that are like-minded, that aren't going to let their disability slow them down.
Right. And if I think about our OT code of ethics, it's probably not a hot topic on podcasts, but, we want to focus on the beneficence, right?
Yep.
But we also need to make sure that we are not engaging in non-maleficence. And when we say that's not for you, quite honestly, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
You're limiting someone's future when you say those kinds of things.
And I think, it's just from not knowing. You look at it. You look at her, particularly a newer injury, and they're just trying to figure out how to keep their blood pressure up and not pass out. And you're obviously not thinking sports in that moment. But as they're moving into rehab, and starting to you can even just playing catch with them when they're seated in their chair. And that's a great way to get them to moving their arms, little components of the sport that they used to play. And there's always kind of two categories. There's people who, after their injury, really want to get back to playing the sports they were playing before, no matter how it looks. And then there's ones that are like, I can't do it the way that I used to do it, and so I don't want to do it at all. And that's kind of how I was. I can't play golf the way that I used to because I can't hold the club. So I had to have a whole different sport that I could fall in love with. But you can see how you could take those different components of basketball or softball or golf or tennis or pickleball and incorporate it into the gym, even with very, very little movement, and getting them to move their bodies and learn how their bodies are moving and what they can do through the use of sport.
And I think we have to do this as people age anyway. I have to adapt how I'm doing things because of injuries and things like that. So I think that's just something that we need to think about as OTs through the lifespan. But I do like this focus on let's get these kids in there as early as possible. I think it makes a huge difference. And I do think I agree with you that not when you're kind of trying not to give bad advice to a client, it usually comes out of ignorance. You have not been educated. And I appreciate what you were saying about timing, but I also think I'm putting my thoughts in this girl who's 13. What a difficult time to get injured. Not that any time isn't, but 13 is hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have all these questions about this injury that you have. And then you see people on TV who have similar injuries doing incredible things. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Whatever stage they're at.
I think it would have been a totally different game if she had been injured at 13 now, like in 2025, because you're going to be seeing things on social media and on TV and people who look like you, who have the same function as you, out there in the world and living successfully and competing. And you get to see, that is for me.
Right.
And I think that's it's so crucial.
That's huge. Well, so on that note, to wrap things up, I could probably talk to you about this forever. What final words of wisdom or inspiration would you like to have to leave with the audience?
Oh, final words. I think the important one is just not to limit people. Like I always say, I'm not fragile. These kids are not fragile. Give them a chance. Let them try out different sports. Let them try out different activities. Because you never know what they're going to fall in love with. And I think don't be an additional barrier to a kid participating. Yeah. So that to me, when I hear that, I think whatever your intake form is, add a line that says, what sports might you be interested in? Yeah. And your initial evaluation. Right. It forces you to have that conversation day one and put it into anything that you do that will force you to circle back with that family. Like you said, the repeated opportunities to discuss it. Yeah, because they may not be ready in that moment when you're first introducing them, but they will, eventually be ready and to hear that and be exposed to it and try it out. And we want to make sure that there's no additional barriers involved in that, and that like as soon as they have that, I might want to try that, bam, they're exposed to it, they're connected with it. They have those opportunities. Because sometimes it's hard when they're on that fence, just a little bit of swaying in the wrong direction, and they may not try it again. And so we really want to make sure that they have that access right away when they're thinking about it and when they're ready for it, that it's sitting waiting for them. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of power in this situation as OTs, because we can be that person who brings this opportunity to them. Yeah, be the connector, be the bridge. Yeah. On that note, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure. And that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you again, Sarah Adam, for the wonderful information about this really important topic. Again, congratulations on your medal in the Paralympic Games, and we'll see you in 2028 in Los Angeles. Yep, that's the plan. Thank you for your insight and your clinical takeaways related to adaptive sports. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I could nerd out on this topic for hours. So, me too. Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Pediatric Pioneers by MedBridge. Please be sure to subscribe and listen to more of our episodes on Spotify or on your favorite podcast platform and at medbridge.com. If you're listening outside of the MedBridge catalog and would like to access the bonus resources and receive continuing education credit, simply log into your MedBridge account and complete the quiz for this episode. Pediatric Pioneers also listens to you. If there is a particular practitioner that you'd like to hear from, or if you have a question or challenge that you'd like to explore on this podcast, please let us know by leaving a comment on our Instagram post or by emailing podcasts@medbridge.com.